Welcome to this webinar on the Balfour Declaration a century later. I am Les Lebedeau of the steering group of Jewish Network for Palestine, JMP for short. This is the first of many webinars that we will hold. As you might expect, we had some technical difficulties or uncertainties at the beginning, but I think they are now solved. So I will firstly introduce Bernard Regan, author of a new book, The Balfour Declaration, Empire, the Mandate, and Resistance in Palestine, recently published by Verso. He will be interviewed by Haim Bresheeth, also of the steering group of Jewish Network for Palestine. If you have any questions for the speaker, then put them into the chat column, and we will choose some of them after the interview. The email message you received advised you to send questions to the JMP email address. That seems to be something automatically included by the Zoom system, as we just realized. So this is a corrective to that message. We won't be monitoring the email address, but we will be monitoring the chat column. The event will be recorded and posted on YouTube. So I hand over to Haim.
Hello, and welcome to everyone. And we're sorry that the meeting ended up being hacked and we had to correct it in the nick of time, but at least we are all here. Now, this is the book that we are discussing today. And it's a very important book. And I would say a few words before I ask my questions of Dr. Bernard Regan. Now, this is the first and most comprehensive book on the Balfour Declaration, not just on the process of the declaration being passed in 1917 and what has happened before it was passed, but actually it's a full story of the British mandate that resulted as the result of that declaration. So I think this is a very important book. It came out just a century in 2018 after the publication of the declaration itself. And I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Bernard Regan today, despite the difficulties. Hello, Bernard.
Hello, Haim. And thank you for the invitation.
Excellent. Now, I want to start by asking you about the timing and manner of that declaration. After all, 1917, in the middle of the First Great War, was an odd time to start a colonial project. The colonial projects were really ending in the 19th century. And by the beginning of the 20th, this was a very rare occasion, a new colonial project. So first, I would like to ask, why do you think the British Empire, which itself was on the way out with difficulties in its very large colonies like India, having lost a number of colonies, and in difficulties elsewhere, why it went into this adventure of starting a new colonial project, and not one of the British Empire, but one of another group altogether?
I think it's a really massive and very important question. When I started to look at it, several things became obvious. I think you're right to say that it was really the nadir of British imperialism that we were witnessing at the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. We'd seen the growth of the United States of America in particular as an economic power and beginning to spread its wings as a world power in military terms. And we also saw that Britain was facing very fierce competition from Germany in terms of its economic progress. And it was in a very challenged position. the interesting thing is that this was a venture which was not really a colonial venture in the same traditional way, if you like, that previous ones had taken place that the British were involved in, where those colonists who had begun the process of colonization elsewhere, like in the United States of America, or more recently in Australia, New Zealand, and so on, were essentially people who had left Britain and had gone to those countries. Here was a quite different initiative. It involved others, if you like, if I can use that general term without being intending in any pejorative sense, the Jewish people who were facing persecution, particularly in Eastern Europe, and were facing pogroms and attacks which had been going on. And so they were not people, if you like, from the British territory. They also, in my view, were unique in that they went to Palestine with a national perspective from the outset, which I'm not convinced was always there at the beginning in places like the United States of America or Australia and so on. So I think they had a completely different mindset. And I don't think they had any, if you like, loyalty to the imperial power that in other experiences of colonialism, you could say took place. So it was a very, in my view, a very kind of unique and different, although obviously within the same general framework of colonization that we saw taking place. And I think the reasons why Britain was keen on it relate to their own imperial interests at heart. And those were ones which were related to their perspective in relation to the empire. Britain at this time, and I can perhaps say this just to get a sense of perspective, I agree with you about the kind of trajectory of British imperialism. It was on the decline, but nevertheless, it was still a massive world power. It controlled virtually a quarter of the world's land territory, virtually a quarter of the world's population. It had vast resources in terms of its exploitation of India and of Africa. And it was anxious to retain those because they were crucial to its economic development. India was robbed, as we know, substantially. And so retaining a capacity to transport goods to and from India was vital. So the Suez Canal was a critical part of that. And their control of Palestine, one military commentator of the day described it as being essential to provide a buffer to protect the Suez Canal by way of having preventing Germany and the Ottoman Empire, which was then at war in the First World War with Britain, from gaining access to the Suez Canal and gaining access to Egypt, and thereby controlling that. German commentators at the time understood this very well. They described Britain's objective as wanting to turn the Indian Ocean into a British lake. And they meant by that the British not only wanted to retain access through the Suez Canal, but also to the whole of East Africa, where Germany had at that time colonies too. The other things that were relevant were that in terms of India, their fear was that Russia, Tsarist Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia, had ambitions towards Afghanistan and through Afghanistan to India in order to gain access to the Indian Ocean and thereby an all-year-round port facility that they didn't have easy access to with their northern ports in Archangel and so on. And they were therefore preoccupied with what the Russians were up to. So they needed to maintain the capacity to, if they were obliged, to be able to send reserves and resources to India swiftly in order to protect it from any incursions that may have occurred from Russia. And the third thing that I think comes into play is oil, which people might think is very early to start citing oil as an issue in the Middle East, but I think it's not. I think it was certainly the case that they were aware of the importance and significance of it. And indeed, in the 10 or 11 years between 1910 and 1920, British use of oil increased 11-fold, very largely as a result of developments that took place in the First World War with the advent of tanks and aircraft and other forms of transportation that required oil. And in 1916 or 1915 rather, Kitchener, who was the major military figure in Britain, wrote a paper called Alexandretta and Mesopotamia, and this was setting out a perspective that it was important for the British to retain a presence in the Middle East area, precisely in order to control access to oil. So I'm very much of the view that these kind of larger scale things framed the way in which Britain saw Palestine as an important issue, and therefore the Balfour Declaration, in a sense, slotted into a kind of scenario that was something they wanted to address.
I wanted to extend this a bit into asking you, of course, when you talk about oil, it was Churchill in 1911 that decided to convert the Royal Navy to working on oil from coal. So obviously this was already being considered before the war. And so Britain was prepared for the war in a better way. But I wanted to raise the issue of why had Britain to go through the Zionist project route rather than go with the House of Saud and T.E. Lawrence and his arrangements in Arabia. I mean, obviously, they didn't have to necessarily do that through the Zionist project. This is an interesting choice in 1917.
It is, and part of me wants to give you a very crude answer, and that is that I think there was a preference for what they perceived to be Europeans engaged in establishing a statal entity in the region, as opposed to Arabs whom they were incredibly disparaging about. I mean, some of the military communiques that came out of the area used absolutely crude racist language about the Arab peoples. So I think there was an affinity there that they perceived, and particularly in Britain. I mean, Leonard Stein's book on the Balfour Declaration is very interesting in referencing, for example, the fact that there were sort of dinner parties at people's houses in which sort of Balfour and Lord Rothschild and various other prominent figures gathered together and chatted. And someone writing for the cabinet in the early 1920s, trying to summarize the history of the debate about the adoption of the Balfour Declaration, makes the point that there were very few records. And my guess is that there were very few records of the detail of the process to achieving the final version of the declaration that was adopted, is because a lot of it was based on common assumptions that they had about what they wished to achieve, and this kind of symmetry, if you like, between the aspirations of Weizmann and the Zionist organization and the British in terms of securing a base there. But they could have gone for the other option. They could have tried to establish a sort of comprador class relationship, a class of people in the country predisposed to working sympathetically with the imperial power, which happened in other parts in Latin America, for example, but also to a certain extent, you could argue, in India. And they didn't go down that route. And I don't see any evidence that they made any substantial attempt to achieve that. They did seem to want from the outset to have an enclave, but not necessarily as a fully fledged independent state without the British Empire, but something which was much more, I suppose you might say, almost akin to something like Hong Kong or something like that, of kind of within the British framework. So it remains kind of a difficult thing to assess why they were so insistent on pursuing that. I don't quite go along with the argument that that was to do with British Christian Zionist beliefs. certainly they were, if you like, predisposed towards a kind of a Christian belief in the importance of the Jews returning to the homeland, as they use the phraseology. But I don't think it can be compared, if you like, to the sort of Christian Zionism that we talk about today in respect of the United States of America, which is absolutely, unequivocally, uncritically supportive of everything that Israel has done, and wishes to see the expansion to a broader horizon of Israel.
I wonder if you could support this, please, by speaking about the text of the declaration, because the text of the declaration is making a lot of the case you have just made, in the sense that there is only one nationality mentioned in the declaration.
Yeah. No, I mean, the declaration is an amazing piece of obscurantism, if you like, about the way in which it was written. It went through many drafts. I mean, at the very least, we know of 7 different versions that appeared at different times, and it's very startling. I mean, we can't put it up on screen at the moment, but if one looks at it for a start, the word Palestine, or the word Palestinian rather, doesn't appear. Even the word Arab doesn't appear anywhere in the text. It talks about a homeland, a national home, and I think that's the first thing to take note of. Is it doesn't talk about a Jewish state; it talks about a national home, and I think it's deliberately an ambiguous formulation, because at that time, and I think it's maybe ironic given some of the debates that take place now in Britain about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It was not the case, of course, ever that there was a monolithic view within the Jewish whole as to what they wished to see happen. The territorialists in Zionism wanted to see land anywhere in the world on which a homeland could be established, as opposed to those who were insistent on Palestine being, the primary destination. And in the period when we are talking about, there was, even in Britain, there were significant differences towards it. So first of all, no state, but a national home, very ambiguous. Then it talks about the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. So again, as I said, it doesn't talk about Palestinians or Arabs even. It talks simply about non-people, if you like, almost. And then the third thing I would note about the draft is that it talks about the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, and that was particularly to meet concerns that were expressed by Edwin Montagu, the only Jewish member of the cabinet, who was concerned that promoting the idea of a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state would actually lead to an increase in anti-Semitism, because the retort would come, if Jews have a homeland, then that is where they should go to. And he wrote a scathing attack on the whole project, spelling out what he saw as an anti-Semitic policy being pursued by the British government, and that the Zionist line of argument on this was actually feeding that and giving it sustenance and endorsing it, if you like, by the way in which it adopted that position. And the document was also, just on this last point with regard to civil and political rights, it was also to try to assuage the position of Curzon, Lord Curzon, who was another member of the cabinet, whose view was that he did not believe that this could be carried through without a great deal of challenge from the indigenous Arab peoples of the region, and he was didn't believe that this was a simple, straightforward matter. So the text is really deliberately very ambiguous, and very deliberately kind of masks a number of views. But my own kind of suspicion and view is that I think Balfour was very clear what he intended by the declaration. And I think he was, that was spelt out much later when he said things about, the wishes of Arabs counts for nothing, or words to that effect, in determining what shall happen in this country. But clearly, amongst others, there were doubts. I mean, even I think it was the House of Commons or the House of Lords, I've forgotten which now, but certainly in the early 1920s, there was a vote against the whole project, which was rapidly overturned by the government, but showed that there was a resistance. And I think that resistance was very often kind of stimulated by sections of those in affinity with the military, who saw it as potentially posing big demands in terms of the requirement of the resources that would be required to kind of marshal, to manage the situation.
Now, of course, the government, and especially Churchill, who was in a controlling position, did not foresee problems militarily and believed that this will pass without major problems. But then immediately in 1920 and markedly in 1921, there were very serious riots, which were again revived in 1929. Could you talk about how this affected, especially post-1929, how this affected the understanding that this is going to be an easy project and doesn't need inviting the Arabs into the discussions at all?
I think one of the things that, if you'll forgive me referencing my book, but one of the things that I was very anxious to kind of communicate, and I think one can argue very strongly, is against this idea that Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian national aspirations suddenly arrive on the scene post the Balfour Declaration, and only come about as a result of animosity towards Jews in Palestine. I think, a very interesting book that's come out recently, Rashid Khalidi's book on 100 Years War on Palestine, talks there about, he cites, just as an example, and I think this is illustrative, I don't think it's exclusive or isolated, but he talks about his great uncle, who was writing to Herzl about the challenges that would be faced in the event that Zionism sought to impose a Jewish state on the land of Palestine. And this was reflected in all sorts of other ways, in newspapers that began to be published in the early part of the 20th century and subsequently. And one of the things, again, that I think is perhaps a consequence of prejudice is this notion that people in Palestinian society were not aware of what was taking place. I think they were very much so. I mean, one of the instances is that, for example, although literacy rates were not particularly high, they were around about 30%, I think, amongst males and less so amongst females. But nevertheless, a lot of people had newspapers read to them in cafes, and there was a general dissemination of information in a way which actually occurred in other lands. I mean, interestingly, in Cuba, in the factories, for example, in the 19th century, people would be read to with newspapers and stories and some of the classics of literature. So I think this equation that some people make between literacy and illiteracy and, if you like, not being political or not being aware of what's happening, I think is a very misguided and erroneous way of looking at people. So the point that I'm making is that in terms of the opposition and the response to events, I think there was a very sharp awareness. I mean, after all, one could even go back into the 19th century when there were demonstrations against colonization that took place in the north of Palestine. Big demonstrations that involved men and women protesting against being evicted from their land and as a consequence of the colonization. So I think there was a generalized consciousness of what were the consequences of the arrival of Zionism and Zionism buying land, expanding, and so on. And this is essentially what is the background to what happened in 1921 and 1929, that there was this attempt to mobilize against immigration. I don't think that meant it was anti-Jewish. I think it was anti-immigrant. It was anti the policies of imperialism. And interestingly enough, I'm not just saying that myself. The reports that were produced reflecting on these events, like the Palin Committee report and the Haycraft Commission, both say similar things. They say that although, yes, the incidents that occurred in 1921 and 29, particularly they're talking about 1921, were about the incidents that occurred involving Jews and Arabs, to use their terminology. But they also go on to say that, in fact, what was behind it was not so much anti-Jewish prejudice, but was anti-British feelings and sentiments. So I think that was very clear. And of course, by this time, you'd also had a series of attempts by the Palestinians to, first of all, to go and register their views at the League of Nations, which was banned. They weren't allowed audience at the League of Nations, whereas the Zionist organization was. They tried to see the British government on several occasions. On one occasion, they came to London, and for literally a year almost, or just short of a year, the delegation was kept waiting and never saw anybody. They went to meet with Churchill in Cairo when the Cairo conference took place in 21. And again, Churchill refused to see them and said, "I'll see you in Jerusalem." And then on arriving in Jerusalem, they were fobbed up by saying, well, all of their concerns had to go via Herbert Samuel, the High Commissioner, who was then acting. So, you know, there was a very much a sidelining and a refusal to engage at any level, in my view, with Palestinian politics. And this was despite the fact that there were, by about 1924, I think that there's something like 6 Palestinian congresses that took place, all of which were very clear in their expression of national aspirations and wishing to create a state. They were also very clear that in doing so, they wanted to respect all the people who lived there, that is the Jews who lived there, as well as the Palestinians, and did not want to make any discrimination whatsoever. And they wanted that in the initial stages, although some people argue this is not quite so convincing, but there was a desire to have an affinity and an association with what we now describe as Lebanon and parts of Syria to create a southern Syria affiliation. But the congresses were very clear in how they expressed their views, and the British were aware of this because just like today, when we're seeing the revelations about spying by the police on organizations in Britain, sure enough, the British were spying on the Palestinian organizations in the 1920s.
Now, they also refused time and again to hold elections in Palestine. And that obviously was related to the fact that any election that would be held would be won by the Palestinians. So I want to take this into the 30s. Your book spends quite a lot of space and effort on the rebellion 1936 to 1939, when the whole of Palestine was rebelling against the British, and the British couldn't actually put it down for 3 years. Could you talk about why that rebellion has happened and what the British did to suppress it?
Yeah. There is a view that the tragic events, and there were tragic events that occurred in 1929, represented a watershed. I'm not so convinced that they represented a watershed. I think they reflected, if you like, the increasing tensions that took place, and the deaths that occurred clearly were tragic circumstances. But I think they were reflective of the heightening tension that was developing. And I think what emerged, and this is not uncommon to any national liberation struggle, that it goes through phases of trying to achieve its objective of self-determination. So there are phases that it passes through, and obviously viewpoints change and mature, and go through all sorts of processes depending on the circumstances. But the situation that developed in the 30s was that I think the prospect of a substantial demographic change within Palestine became increasingly evident, particularly through the mid-1930s, with the influx of immigrants seeking refuge from fascism in Germany and the anti-Semitism that was taking place in Eastern Europe. And that, I think, began to shift the demographic balance that existed in Palestine to an extent that I think elevated the awareness of what the potential was for the creation of a Zionist state. And I think that led to the kind of responses that were made. But what was interesting about them, or what I would argue was interesting about them, was that they were much more generalized in the way in which they expressed their opposition, with the formation of national committees throughout a whole number of towns. And although there was certainly armed confrontation between Palestinian and Arab forces and the British in particular, although it began in some instances with incidents involving attacks on Jewish people, latterly it transformed completely and was wholly focused on opposition to the British. And these committees were, if you like, in most of the towns, there were whole areas which the British were unable to enter. The British actually brought in increased forces, increased air force, military forces on the ground, and also the Navy came in to act in a combined way to oppose the uprising that was taking place. And it went through periods of lulls. It wasn't, it wasn't a linear struggle that took place from 36 to 39. There were moments of ceasefires, there were moments of passivity, and then the kind of the regeneralization of strike action, boycott action, military, conflicts that took place. And this was really much more substantial, to the extent that the British engaged in aerial bombing of villages. And it was ironic that here, at the same time that in Spain you had the Luftwaffe supporting Franco bombing villages in the Basque country and elsewhere in the Republican countries, you had the British doing the same, bombing people who were completely defenseless to this kind of assault. And they went further than that, of course. They went on as, I mean, in 1929, just to cast back, they arrested 1,000 people and sentenced people to death, and really enacted a repressive regime. They introduced martial law. The British introduced collective punishments and destroying houses that belonged to relatives or to people they perceived as being involved in the actions. I mean, it's nothing new. The British did this in Ireland when the Irish were fighting for independence. They burnt houses down, they destroyed houses, they imposed fines on people and so on. And we know only too well, and I'm sure it's in your book, Haim, the IDF act in much the same way today, in terms of using human shields, in terms of destroying houses, and in terms of kind of imposing martial law and lockdowns and checkpoints and all of those kind of things. And they learned that from the undoubtedly they learned that from the British.
Actually, British officers have trained during this period, 1936 to 1939, special units, of course, of the Zionist forces, as you speak about in your book. And these were the kernel of the IDF later on. So we both deal with this process at different points in time. It's really a process that most people in British are not aware of. I had two other questions, but I think because we've started late because of this hack,
yeah.
I want to pass back to the chair, who will have the audience questions.
Yes, I think I'll do this in somewhat chronological order. So firstly, go back to the Balfour Declaration itself. Bernard discussed the question, why did the British Empire go for the Zionist option rather than the Saudi option? So here are a couple possible reasons why, and you could comment on those. One, that the Zionist option might, in the imagination of the British imperial strategists, that is, the Zionist option might please Russian Jews and so help turn them against revolution, and thus, maintain the Russian Empire as an ally against the German Empire in World War I. That's one. And then the second, somewhat different, this is the famous quotation in 1916 from a British colonial officer, I think the consul general, who said that a future Jewish homeland in Palestine would be a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. Multiple meanings there. So those are two possible explanations alongside the ones that you gave.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there's another factor in relation to why didn't they go for the Saudi option that relates to the contending ambitions within the Arab world. So the Saudis, very shortly after this, launched an attack on Hussein and split the peninsula and came to dominance. And it's one of the few countries in the world where you have a country named after a family, but that's what Saudi Arabia is. And so they were at war with Hussein. They had ambitions in respect of that. And I think that certainly through British intelligence or British knowledge of the area, I think they were very conscious of that. That was a kind of, there was maybe instability that couldn't give them the sort of guarantees that they were looking for in terms of this buffer that they wanted to create to protect the Suez Canal and to protect their ambitions in Egypt. I just, if I may, just going back to the point that Haim made about what happened in 36 and post 36 and the kind of reprisals and viciousness of the British, which I think we should throw into the equation, is that at this time, Mussolini was seeking to gain a foothold, and as he did, to invade Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and also in Libya. And one of the anxieties for the British, and the reason I think why they were vicious in their suppression of the Arab Revolt of 1936-39 in Palestine, was that they saw the danger that the Italians might close off the bottom end of the Red Sea and close the Gulf in relation to Aden, for example. So that was another kind of question. But to go back to the why they didn't choose the Saudis, I think that might be one component, and there was no real stability. I mean, after all, the British, in a sense, almost were the kingmakers in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, in kind of awarding it to the Hussein family, and they tried to do the same in Syria. I think, with regard to the question of Russian Jews and so on. I mean, I think an interesting thing is that actually there was, of course, a much greater, well, not a much greater, sorry, that's the wrong thing to say, but there was a very large Jewish immigrant community in the United States of America. And they actually were very hostile to the idea that America should enter the war on the side of Britain, precisely because Russia was part of the Entente. They thought that this was siding. Well, they were right. This would have been siding with a completely anti-Semitic, viciously anti-Semitic regime, despite the fact that we know that Herzl in 1902 or 1903 went to visit the Tsar to gain the Tsar's agreement and finished up talking to a member of von Plev's department about support for a version, if you like, of what became the Balfour Declaration in terms of Russian sponsorship. So there was certainly a kind of consciousness of these other dynamics that were in play. I mean, there was a very strong anxiety also that Germany was actually going to be the beneficiary of alliance with Zionism. The World Zionist Organization was based in Berlin, just around the corner from the German Foreign Embassy. And, they worked quite closely with them. And it was, to some extent, in the early days, in amongst sections of the English media and the British political classes, they viewed Zionism as essentially a German alliance or a German inspired kind of initiative. So there were all sorts of kind of factors at play in relation to that. Churchill, of course, had written newspaper articles where he talked about what he described as the good Jew and the bad Jew. The good Jew was the one who was loyal to the imperial values of Britain and was, supportive of everything that the British Empire stood for. And the bad Jew was this cosmopolitan, rootless individual, which was, in a sense, code for communist or socialist or whatever. And they were fearful of the potential influence of socialists, Jewish socialists, in terms of how they might, the roles they might play inside Britain. That was another kind of factor that was at play. With regard to the comment about the little loyal Ulster in the Middle East, that refers to Storrs, who was one of the senior civil servants in Jerusalem for the British. And he wrote that in his autobiography in the 1930s, sometime after. But I think it does very succinctly give an image of exactly what the Zionist homeland became. And that was a little loyalist Ulster, in other words, an enclave which was kind of within the framework of the British Empire. Although, as we know, that was not the position of Jabotinsky. That was not the position within Palestine itself, with forces coming very much to the fore, saying, neither Britain nor Germany, will fight for independence. But certainly, it had that kind of potential. The British, as people will know, established colonies in the north of Ireland, in Ulster, particularly in what were the most rebellious parts of Ireland, with the O'Neills and other clans who were fighting to throw the British out. And it was Queen Elizabeth and I think it was James I, I think, I can't remember now, but I wasn't there at the time. But they were the ones who set up these colonies with the direct intention of creating, as they perceived it, stable areas that would kind of retain loyalty to the British Crown. And I think Storrs' comment is very insightful.
Say prophetic. And I'll ask another question, which has clear resonances today, a century later, about Jewish representation and double sense. That is, who represents Jews, which Jews, distinctions among Jews, as in Churchill's binary. At the time of the Balfour Declaration, there were organizations of Jews who were descended from those who had lived in that area for generations, alongside the Zionist organizations. How did the British project relate differentially to those types of organizations, and thus, represent Jews in a particular way?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's all the evidence that I've seen, and it's not an area I've read thoroughly on, but the evidence that I have come across in respect of Jews who lived in Palestine itself at the time of the Mandate and at the time of the Balfour Declaration and British occupation of Palestine, were quite found the European Zionists, as they were, very alien. They were not at all people that they related to. They were quite shocked by the behavior of these Europeans as they saw them, walking in the streets, women bareheaded and so on, and not forming to the conventions, if you like, as they perceived it of their lives. And these were Jews who were Arab speaking, who lived in towns alongside Arab neighbors and Arab families, and were completely integrated into and part of an integrated society. I don't mean integrated in the sense that they were not there authentically, they were, but they were part of that society. They were not something distinct. And so that was, and there were instances where they were literally quite shocked by the behavior as they perceived it of these European Jews who came along. And indeed, there were discussions, certainly in the early 1920s, about raising the whole question. And it goes back to the point I made earlier about the Palestinian Congress, which was very assertive about all of the people who lived in Palestine having an entitlement. And that meant all the Jews, all the Muslims, all the Christians, all the people of other faiths who lived in that region being part of it and not having any kind of notion of differentiation. And that was something that they stated quite clearly. And it's interesting because what you talk about in terms of kind of this kind of notion of the Jewish world being completely homogenous. I mean, I've just been reading Bernard Wasserstein's book it's called On the Eve, which is about Jews in the 1930s. And it's an absolutely fascinating account of the differentiation between Jews living in Germany, living in Poland, living in different parts of Eastern Europe, of their social, cultural, linguistic, cultural background, and the kind of richness of that, and the incredible, wealth as an outsider that I perceive in that situation, which we have to note was utterly destroyed by the Holocaust. That was a fact, and an incredibly rich political differentiation, and that was true in respect of Zionism in Britain and the Jewish community in Britain. The Jewish community in Britain did not endorse the Balfour Declaration. It was opposed right up really until a few months before it was signed. In June and July, it wasn't until relatively late that the Board of Deputies actually adopted a position of supporting it. So there was I think there were very different, and there were those, of course, whose views were quite opposed to Zionism and did not support the notion that Jews should have a homeland in Palestine, who believed that Jews should be part of the world in which they lived.
Okay, thanks. Let's go a few years later to the Sykes-Pico Treaty. It was a question that came in. I mean, this was an attempt to deal with many strategic issues all at once, including French-British rivalry and management or control of the indigenous populations. So how did that treaty turn out to clarify or facilitate the British strategy, as regards the the instrumentalization of Palestine?
I'm laughing because I'm trying to think of a polite way of formulating it, but you know, somebody once said, the sun always shines on the British Empire, to which the reply came, that's because God doesn't trust them. And I think that's absolutely appropriate. You know, what we had when the British were negotiating the Sykes-Picot Agreement, simultaneously they were talking with Hussein, and the McMahon-Hussein correspondence was taking place, in which they formulated what was called the Damascus Protocol, which was essentially the statement of what the Arab ambitions were in response to and return for an alliance with Britain against the Ottomans and against Germany. And there was a map which was produced, which I came to light actually after I had written the book, which showed very clearly the demarcation that they indicated that should be part of an independent Arab world. And it clearly, absolutely crystal clearly indicated that included the whole of Palestine, you know, without any shadow of a doubt. And it included the whole of the peninsula. It borders really coincided with the more or less, crudely speaking, the border now between Syria and Turkey. And the only exception was Aden, which they left as a kind of British enclave for reasons that I mentioned before about the Red Sea and the British wanting to retain control over that area. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was being negotiated with the French. The French themselves had ambitions on Palestine. They did not just give up the idea that their ambitions were principally focused on Syria and Lebanon. And of course, we've seen that recently echoed in Macron's very swift visit to Beirut post the tragic bombing incident that occurred, which is almost kind of very crudely, you know, a reaffirmation of French ambitions in the region. So Sykes-Picot, you know, it left the question of Palestine in some ambiguous sense. The French certainly did wish to have and thought they had a right to have some kind of toehold in Palestine. The British talked about, and this was kind of the thing that was regurgitated time and again, even as late as the 1930s, when they talked about partition. They talked about, you know, the holy places, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, as being in international control, but the rest of the region being, for the British part, their responsibility, but the French also wishing to retain some ambitions towards that. And this was reflected later in the negotiations about the building of the railway and the oil lines from the Mediterranean through to Mesopotamia, where those should actually go, and the British wanting to ensure they were in areas that they could control, and the French also wishing to do the same.
Okay, thanks. Now we move ahead further in time. You already discussed the 36 to 39 Palestinian revolt and its suppression by the British. We had a question that adds that half of all male adults in the mountainous region of Palestine were wounded or jailed by the British during that revolt. And moreover, Palestinian society was dismembered, defenseless, and leaderless at the end of that suppression. So the questioner asks whether 39 can be identified as the British inflicted Nakba, or perhaps as facilitating what later became called the Nakba in 48.
I have to put my cards on the table. I very strongly agree with that. I think that that was a tragedy in which the Palestinian national aspirations, which were actually being mobilized on a countrywide basis involving whole sort of sections of the community, including not only the youth, but women, as well as male members of the community, was really the moment. But then, you know, one has to weigh it in the balance. So Britain as a world power at that stage, and the odds being, overwhelmingly against that revolt. But I think it was, if you like, a high point, and the defeat that was inflicted on the Palestinians with all of the attendant, victimizations and punishments and so on and so forth, I think must have had a significant effect, because after all, following 36-39, the Palestinians were essentially disarmed. Any capacity to fight back or resist was removed by the removal of weapons. We had going on at this time, I think if I'm right, Ilan Pape records this, that we had a extensive mapping by the Zionist forces, the Haganah and so on, of those villages which has participated in that revolt, identifying, in other words, potential centers of rebellion against the British and against the Zionist project. Of course, during the Second World War, the whole of the area was a very substantial land base for the British Army in terms of the fight that was taking place in the north of Africa between the British and Germany. And I think that the consequences of what happened in 36-39 was that when we get to 1948, I think the Palestinians are, as I've said, substantially disarmed and in a very much more vulnerable position, socially and economically, as well as militarily, to resist what took place. Because undoubtedly, I think if the British had not been present in 36-39 and a Palestinian state had been created, which, and again, it's very subjective, but I think would have been one that had been encompassing of all of those people who were then in the country, then I think in addition to that, of course, 48 would not have happened.
The British suppression is the flip side of the Zionist unit within the British forces that helped carry out the suppression.
No, that's right. I mean, as Haim said, Ord Wingate was commissioned by the British to work with the Haganah to create forces, night forces, I think they were called, which carried out the terrorizing of Palestinian villages, and in conjunction with this process of identifying centers of resistance. And they kept very detailed accounts. I mean, there's Yehoshua Poroth's book on the Palestinian National Movement, has an appendix in it which has got a list of all of the people who were, arrested, who were participants. Not all, but a significant kind of appendix which details. And the interesting thing about it is that socially, they were from all sorts of layers of society within Palestinian society, which is illustrative of the fact that this was a real national uprising, in my view.
I'll just ask one more question before I hand back to Haim, who already had some questions and by now may have some more. So if we look at the anniversary commemorations of the Belfair Declaration that were held a few years ago, and some of them are continuing still today, I mean, how do you see the multiple representations of what happened a century ago today as perhaps serving different political agendas about politics today, and thereby skewing those representations?
It's not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's illustrative of current British political thinking. People will be aware of the growth and expansion of Black Lives Matter campaign. And there has been advice which has gone out from the British government Department for Education to schools, talking about the question of, as they perceive it, organizations which are extremist. And they talk about organizations which are opposed to democracy, which are anti-capitalist, and so on and so forth. And in the House of Commons, one of the Conservative ministers said that she regarded Black Lives Matter as an anti-capitalist organization, in other words, it was an extremist organization. And so I think this kind of absolute failure and refusal to come to terms with the imperial history of Britain and acknowledge the need to decolonize political thinking as well as curriculum in schools and within universities and so on is something that they are resistant to this day of acknowledging that there is even a debate about these issues. And I think that that's reflected in the and I think ignorance is the right word to use of the way in which there is a response to any kind of attempt to debate the role of Zionism and to present the notion that Zionism, is a political phenomena, political ideology, and that as such it is like any other ideology or political organization is subject to scrutiny and critique. So I think, in other words, what I'm seeing is this kind of, if I can use the term, I hope I'm not abusing it, a sort of cancel culture of people who want to challenge the notion that what is regarded as the orthodox narrative is something which is not something that should be accepted.
Well, I'll just ask a sub-question to that question before I hand back to Haim, and that is, on that century anniversary, much was said about Britain's responsibility for causing or setting the stage for the ongoing conflict, and especially all the harm that was done to Palestinians, and therefore its responsibility to redress those wrongs in some way. But I had the impression this was left very vague about what that meant. How do you see those discussions and what it should mean today?
Yeah, I mean, there is a school of thought, and I respect the individuals who advocate it, but I profoundly disagree with them, who say that the Balfour Declaration had two components. One was a promise to the Jews for a homeland, and the other was for the Palestinians to have their rights acknowledged and in some way kind of reflected in the political agreement, if you like, or political outcome that would happen as a result of that. And I sadly, I see no evidence of that. I don't believe that the Balfour Declaration did embody any such commitment. I mean, for example, it talked about civil and religious rights of non-Jewish community. It never mentioned the word political. And that's not just me reading into it with hindsight. That was actually what the Palestinian delegation that was seeking to gain entry to the League of Nations wrote to the League of Nations at the time. In other words, they very clearly and very accurately and very intelligently understood that this refusal to incorporate the political rights was precisely a denial of the right to self-determination. And this, of course, was the general kind of framework within which all of these questions, like the creation of a Jewish homeland, were allegedly being posed. That is, that the right to self-determination was de rigueur. It was part of the political environment of the day, with Woodrow Wilson, who he wasn't, if you really study what he was saying, but allegedly the advocate for self-determination. I mean, I will say this, which might not be pleasant to some people's ears, but the only authentic, sincere advocates for self-determination were actually the Bolsheviks in Russia, who made a statement before Wilson that countries were entitled to be free of the Tsarist yoke and the Russian Empire should be dismembered and so on. So, I think these things were all part of the equation, and I don't think that the Balfour Declaration did embody an authentic, sincere, genuine, meaningful, legally pursuable argument for the rights of the Palestinians in any way, sense, or form. I understand why some people would wish that were the case, but I think one has to be extremely charitable beyond the scope of reason to think it did that.
So we might say that the Balfour Declaration has been sanitized not only by the British ruling elite, but also by many people who may sympathize with the Palestinians, but in a future
Yeah.
way.
I mean, I some of them are friends, so I don't want to upset them, but they know my view, and it would be, there's no point in having a discussion like this unless we're absolutely candid, and it's just a completely flawed line of argument.
Okay, that's great. So I've had my opportunity here to add my own questions to those in the chat, and apologize to those whose questions weren't taken up, but we're short on time. But except that Haim now will decide how many more of his questions to ask.
Just one.
Good.
This is related exactly to what we just asked. The last question is really an overarching query. I think you're totally right about the Balfour Declaration in what you just said. And those people that have those misconceptions should read your book. This is the best way of finding out
That's very kind.
What the declaration meant at the time and for 30 years afterwards. So any confusion they might still hold will be cleared. But I want to talk about a confusion in the British minds of those who run the 30 years of the mandate. I'm starting from the concept of an end game. It seems, reading your book, which is very detailed and speaks about every single stage of the mandate, that the British didn't work out the end game and refused to do so. And as a result, there were a lot of contradictions, both between the people who run the mandate in Palestine and in London itself, and within the authority of the mandate, because nobody, and this is not surprising to us in 2020, where the British government is unable to make its mind up. So it seems to me that your book is very carefully mapping the indecision and lack of analysis, despite of the many reports that were written for and by government agencies. So how did the British see the end game, and how did they decide, okay, this is the time to leave, and why did they decide that?
I'm not sure that they had ever a conception of what the end game was. I mean, I was flicking through the Peel report, which was produced in 1937, which was really an attempt to deal with the issues arising from the uprising in 36, 39. And that was where they significantly introduced the whole notion of partition in that. And they proposed, as I mentioned earlier, they still clung on to this notion of areas that were going to be under the control of an international body because they were religious, regarded as religious centers like Jerusalem and so on. And the Peel report is really kind of, it seems to be the last throw of the dice, where they were trying to figure out what would be, how they could deal with the realities of the situation. Interestingly, alongside it in the cabinet papers are commentaries by military figures on the ground who basically say, there is no way in which we are going to reach a resolution of this issue without further conflict, and that the opposition amongst the Palestinians was mounting. And this was, of course, in the middle of 36, 39, that mounting opposition was very, very strong in terms of what would happen. So my own view is that I don't think they had any notion of what the end game was. I think when you come to the end of the Second World War, what was happening in to some extent was a war weariness, as there was indeed, of course, after the First World War, but a war weariness that was meaning that the British, I think, may well have had difficulties in retaining sufficient forces in the area in a combat readiness to deal with the kind of challenges that they faced. There were, after all, some mutinies amongst American soldiers who didn't wish to carry on fighting at the end of that war. And I think the British were unsure whether they had the resources and the capacity to deal with that. The independence movement in India was growing, and they had relied very heavily in the Middle East on Indian troops as part of their military disposition in the region. And I think that they were not confident that that was to be the case. So I don't think they had really had a worked out endgame at all. I think it was symptomatic of the state of disarray and disintegration that was beginning to really show itself in the British Empire, which came about with the independence of India, came about with changes that then took place in the 50s and 60s with independence in Africa and so on. There's one thing that we haven't touched on. May I raise?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that more recently I've been looking at that I think is not explored sufficiently, and to all of the people who say that there was no alternative to the creation of Palestine for a safe haven for Jews, is the complete and utter anti-Semitism of the British and the Americans and other countries in refusing to accept refugees in the 1930s. On a colossal scale, the number of refugees that were able to come to Britain up until 1939 was tiny, was something like 12,000. And in America, similarly, are very low numbers. And it's interesting because one of the books I was looking at in relation to that talked about how the British in the 17th century allowed 120,000 French Protestants to come into Britain as refugees. So I think, when people try to accuse the Palestinians of anti-Semitism or to raise the specter of critiquing the creation of the State of Israel or critiquing Zionism, I think, on the contrary, the thing should be not exactly, but metaphorically turned on its head in terms of the role that Britain and other countries played in putting obstacles to the capacity, the ability of Jews to seek refuge from the horrors that were developing in Eastern Europe and, of course, were developing in Germany. And I think it's something left out of the equation. There's an attempt to kind of present, and of course, one pays due respect to the kinder transport and so on, but on an industrial scale, Britain, America, and other countries failed, in my view, to accept refugees, just as we're seeing the same today in the case of Syria.
Thank you, Bernard. That's great. So I think we'll conclude here. And thanks to Haim for his interview questions. And I'll just conclude with an announcement of our next webinar, exactly 2 weeks from now. And the details should appear soon on our Facebook page, Jewish Network for Palestine.